Okay. Okay, everybody. Well, it's just gone 3 o'clock in the UK, and it gives me enormous pleasure. Actually, I often have this enormous pleasure, and that is speaking to Stephen Hansen, my long-term co-author, he is at UCL, IFS, and the CEPR. And a little bit unusually, when I asked him to do this, I asked Stephen not to present one paper, but I gave him a kind of topical question, which is traditional text analysis dead in an era of LLMs? And so one reason I thought he was the absolutely ideal person to answer this is because he and I started doing things with text more years ago than I care to publicly broadcast now, but many years ago. And we've seen lots of changes. The profession has become much more open to the use of text. But then in the last few years, we've seen this explosion of capacity in LLMs and what they can do. And so I think it's a super interesting question about where some of the traditional stuff goes, whether they're complements, substitutes, what we do. So, Stephen, thank you so much for coming on, and I hand the floor over to you. And for people in the audience, if you have questions, clarifying or otherwise, if you put them in the Q&A, then I will push them to Stephen at appropriate times, and some will be left till the end. Stephen's going to talk for about 45, 50 minutes, and then we'll discuss for as long as there are questions or other issues, with our hard stop being just before 4:15 in the UK. So it's an hour and 13 minutes. Perfect. All right, Stephen, over to you.
So, sorry, Michael,
Yeah.
before we begin, one technical question. Can you see my mouse hovering over the PDF?
Yes. Yes, I
Perfect.
can.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you, Michael. I think this is the second time that I've been to this webinar series. I was here a couple of years ago discussing LLMs when they were sort of first being introduced, and sort of nice to come a couple of years later and talk about what they might be useful for and maybe what they might not be useful for, or at least what they might be less useful for compared to uh, more traditional methods. Okay, so I probably made a few too many slides here, so I'll probably selectively skip through some of the material. But as Michael said, this draws on 3 different papers in which we've explored in different ways how LLMs can be used and how they might compare to traditional methods. So the first is more of an econometrics paper on modeling the measurement error that AI, LLM, and text algorithms produce in variables and how to correct for that in regressions. The second is about trying to measure firm level shock exposure to aggregate conditions. And the third, which I'll probably spend the most time on, is joint work with Michael and a couple of other co-authors on policymakers' uncertainty. So let me jump in and maybe begin by asking the question, what is traditional text analysis? So certainly one thing that I can document is a progression of algorithms over the last 10 or 15 years in economics. So we started with sort of keyword counting methods, dictionary methods. And then after that, people started to explore like the full vocabulary of documents via factor models and topic models. Then starting about, say, 8 years ago, neural language models became influential, beginning with word embeddings. And then I'll call them kind of small LLMs, BERT and Co. And then more recently, we have these large AI models. So I guess there's different ways of drawing a line under where traditional text analysis begins and where it ends. But I guess I'm going to take the view that most people now, when they think about text analysis in economics, use these large AI models. Okay, so I'm gonna draw the line here. I'm gonna call everything before large AI models traditional text analysis, and these sort of AI models as being the modern go-to method. Okay. And one of the things that I want to emphasize in the next 45 minutes is it's not clear at all to me that AI models are always the go-to tool, no matter what measurement problem that you face. So I think one of their key strengths, and I'll illustrate this in the paper with Michael, is being able to measure phenomena that are very difficult to even label. Okay, so like truly latent variables, things like narratives and causation that people express in natural language, right? These are very sort of difficult concepts to even assign a objective label to. And I think for that, AI models can be extremely useful. But if we're in a world where there really do exist sort of objective labels that we can place on documents, it's not clear that AI is always the best tool to use. Okay. I should point out that when we think about the question, which tool should I use for the measurement problem at hand? I think one of the reasons people use AI models is because they're very easy to use. So you don't really have to know Python to use an AI model. Whereas if you want to implement dictionary methods, at least until recently, you had to have a little bit of engagement with the actual data processing and coding and whatnot. Okay, so I think there are sort of pragmatic reasons why people use AI models, but I really want to think about methodological reasons why one might use them and not. Okay, so let's go to like the most canonical type of machine learning measurement exercise that one could imagine. Okay, so this is a setting where there is training data, test data, validation data, and you can just straight up compare different algorithms against each other. Okay, so this is like a very classic setting for trying to discuss the trade-offs between using different approaches. So in the spirit of this seminar, I want to illustrate this machine learning task on a central bank communication type data set. So this is the training data provided by the Voice of Monetary Policy paper by Yuri Gorganchenko and co-authors in the AER a couple of years ago. So in building this paper, they need to come up with a hawkish sentiment index for Fed communication. And the way that they proceed is to manually label around 1,200 individual sentences from FOMC statements as hawkish, neutral, or dovish, and then use BERT to fine-tune BERT model to predict these three labels and then document the out-of-sample performance. Okay, but of course you don't have to use BERT. You could use any method, right? Going back to dictionary methods or topic models or modern AI models. Okay, so a very first question is, do AI models outperform fine-tuned BERT? So here's the results. So just to be clear what I'm plotting, the y-axis is the test set error rate of different models. So that would be the sort of classic performance metric in machine learning. And these are the typical performance metrics reported in economics papers that do these classification exercises. The x-axis has the size of the model in log scale. Okay. So what do you see? AI models, at least among the methods that are being compared in this exercise, are the worst performing in terms of this classic out of sample goodness of fit test set error rate metric. Okay. So that's both true of classic zero-shot learning. So the ZS here refers to zero shots, where the particular model is prompted without any example data of what hawk, neutral, and dove means. Six-shot means that we've randomly sampled two hawkish examples, two neutral examples, and two dovish examples, included those in the prompt to sort of guide the model's understanding of what we wish to do. Okay. But whether we do zero-shot learning or few-shot learning, none of these AI models outperform not just fine-tuned BERT, which was the choice of the authors of this particular paper, but they actually don't outperform logistic regression. So what do I mean by logistic regression here? I mean forming the document term matrix that corresponds to the label data set and just fitting a penalized logistic regression. Okay, so that's about as typical as one could get. Okay, so I think that this is not well known. People seem to have an almost evangelical faith that this must be wrong. So, how have you prompted the model? Why have you not used Claude Opus 5 because it's newer than Claude Sonnet 4? And, all of this pushback that there must be something wrong with a comparison exercise where AI models do not outperform sort of older traditional models. Okay. So one thing I'll say is I'm not surprised at all that they don't outperform BERT. Okay. So when you think about the training objective of an AI model, they are not fine-tuned on specific economic measurement tasks, right? They're fine-tuned on a very generic set of tasks that are either arising from reinforcement learning with human feedback, or more recently reinforcement learning with verifiable feedback, but they are not targeted at measuring sentiment. And in a sense, BERT is, right? Because once you fine tune a small model against a very particular measurement problem that you have, it's not surprising that you might do better. Okay. I guess it's more surprising that logistic regression outperforms these. I'm not sure I have an explanation for that, but maybe keywords are enough to pin down what's hawkish and what's dovish, and logistic regression is sort of learning keywords. Okay.
Stephen, there's one question that has come in, and it relates to a comment I was going to make. This is actually not dissimilar to something that Max Ahrens, Andragos Gordoza, and I found for different data sets. But the question that comes in is linked to this about whether even these performance of the sort of the more modern AI models might be overstated because they may have the language that's in their training set. They may already have the 1,243 sentences from Fed
Sure.
statements. So what might we be even doing them a little bit, saying they're too good here relative to their actual performance?
Exactly. And this whole discussion, by the way, is just about the y-axis, right? This traditional performance metric. I think there are good reasons to care about the x-axis too. So one is just cost, right? If you wanted to use these models at scale, their cost would sort of scale in model size. But there also may be statistical reasons why you prefer logistic regression, right? If you want to actually establish some asymptotic theory about the inner workings of these classification models, it's going to be way easier with a logistic regression than a big complex transformer model. Okay? And incidentally, all of the models have a relatively high error rate, right? So if you're using any AI-generated regressors, you need to worry about the error rate corrupting downstream inference. I should also say that for fun, I did the same exercise on the EPU data. So this is the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index of Baker, Bloom, and Davis. They have their human labeled data online. So you can do the same exercise of fitting these classifiers on training data and recording test set performance. So here, the AI model is sort of competitive with the fine-tuned small model, but it does not outperform it. And it's 2 orders of magnitude bigger. Okay. So my prior is that there are very few settings where an off-the-shelf generic AI model combined with zero-shot learning is the preferred technology for these sort of objective measurement problems. Okay. I think typically using this sort of smaller, fine-tuned model is my go-to, and I feel confident in saying that I view that as sort of generically true across many problems. All right, so just to, I guess, reiterate the point, there's no sense in my mind that modern AI models have solved the problem of mapping text to variables. In some cases, they seem to worsen it, not only with respect to smaller fine-tuned models, but also with respect to more traditional methods. Okay. If you are interested in the follow-on problem of how one would correct for measurement error in downstream regression models where these AI-generated indices are used, that's what the paper that I referenced in the second slide tries to do. Okay, so there's a Python package and an R package that you can use to apply a bias correction to a downstream regression model that has incorporated one of these noisy indices. Okay, I'm now going to turn to a second problem, which in some respects is the opposite of the first problem. So the problem that I just spoke about is one where there is a very specific variable that one wishes to measure at the document level. and there is a human labeled data set that one can use to train a model to learn the mapping from text to outcome. So in the problem I'm going to discuss now, there really isn't a underlying categorical variable that one is wishing to extract from text. There's something much more amorphous. Right? So I will call this generic problem denoising and interpreting asset-based shocks. So I'm going to discuss this in a particular context, but maybe to motivate it more broadly, there's this very common empirical strategy in monetary economics and central bank communication to use asset price changes around central bank announcements to build a measure of monetary policy surprise. Okay? And our idea in this work is that those asset-based surprise or shock measures might be contaminated by noise in asset prices that's orthogonal to the actual event whose news you wish to measure. And you can use text to try to denoise those shock measures. Okay. And as I'll show you, the bag of words model is pretty successful at doing that without needing to appeal to any of the modern AI tools. Okay, so the particular motivation for this work is to explain the well-documented empirical phenomenon of countercyclical dispersion in firm-level outcomes. So this is one particular example of that. So we take a balanced panel of firms from Compustat, compute firm-level revenue growth at the quarterly frequency, and then compute the standard deviation across firms in each quarter and plot it on a time series. In BER recessions are shaded, and what you notice is in the last three big recessions, there's been this spike in firm level dispersion, right? And we want to account for why you see this rise in firm level dispersion across the business cycle. And there's a very sort of well-known leading explanation for that. Perhaps Nick Bloom is the first person to point this out, but there's lots of work by now in this area, that this corresponds to fluctuations in uncertainty. Okay, and when you enter recessions, there is more uncertainty, so firms are hit with idiosyncratic shocks that have a larger variance, and that's what drives this. Okay, so a simple production function would be this sort of Cobb-Douglas, where the variance in firm level shocks rises in recessions. So we have a slightly different story. Our story is not that idiosyncratic shock volatility goes up in recessions. It's that recessions coincide with the arrival of macro new shocks. Okay, so this is an aggregate phenomenon, not a firm level phenomenon. All right, but firms are heterogeneously exposed to those aggregate shocks. Okay, so if our reading of this countercyclical dispersion is correct, the stock market might be a place to go start proxying the size of firm level exposure to different aggregate shocks, right? Because if on days where big macro news events happen, markets correctly price the transmission of those shocks at the firm level, that should show up in the dispersion in abnormal returns on dates where those macro news shocks arrive. So this is a nice motivating plot for that idea. So the x-axis records the size of the move in the aggregate equity market for US securities across different large so-called jump dates in 2020 to 2022. Okay, so every dot on this figure corresponds to a trading day. And so this right tail are trading days where there's been a large positive move in markets. And the left tail is when there's been a large negative move in markets. So what we're interested in is this y-axis, which is the dispersion in firm level returns on these trading days. So what do you notice? When there is a larger aggregate market move, there's also more dispersion in firm level returns, which is consistent with this idea that when big macro news shocks arrive, they are, at least in expected value terms, going to generate dispersion in firm level outcomes. So we have a big econometric framework, but what I'm about to run is sort of a classic local projection, if you will. Okay, so for all of you sitting in the audience of this seminar, you probably would have seen econometric models like this in the context of measuring the effects of central bank communication. Okay, so we want to look at a firm's exposure to a macro shock, and we're going to do that via this vector EI, all right, which is going to collect all these firm level exposure measures. Okay. And we want to try to understand whether firm level exposure to a macro shock, as proxied in the first instance by returns, has a effect on future firm outcomes. Okay, so basically a panel local projection. Okay? Now, our initial exposures are going to be just the straight up returns on these macro news days. So for concreteness, I'm going to pick the 9 dots in red. Okay, so these are all days where the aggregate market move has been attributed to the pandemic. Okay, so all of these are 2020 jump dates. I'm also going to use these blue triangles, which are dates attributed to inflation surprises in 2022. So I'm just going to use the firm level return on these dates as an exposure measure. Okay, so just the raw asset price change. So when you estimate this local projection using raw returns as an exposure measure, you get sort of qualitatively sensible effects on firm level growth, but they're very weak and very transient, right? So the pandemic arrived in 2020 Q1. And okay, so it's true that for one quarter, there was an effect of being more exposed to the pandemic and having higher revenue growth, but it quickly dissipates to zero. And for inflation, there's almost nothing. Okay. So one problem is that those abnormal returns may contain noise, which is attenuating the effect of news. Okay. And again, we kind of established this in an econometric framework. But the idea is how would you denoise returns to try to get a more accurate measure of the impact of exposure to macro news shocks on outcomes? So our idea is to use corporate filings. Okay, so and we're going to use these corporate filings prior to any of the news shocks that we're studying here. Okay, so prior to 2020 and 2022, we're going to collate firms' 10K filings and look at the risk factors section. So the idea is that the risk factors in these 10K filings describe a bunch of different firm characteristics that might be important for the transmission of macro shocks into their later growth rates. Okay? And by regressing the abnormal return on the content of these 10K filings, we can try to extract the part of the abnormal return that's driven by firm fundamentals. Okay, and then everything left over in the residual of the return might just be noise. Okay, so how are we going to do that? Well, this is an amorphous problem, right? I mean, this is it's not a classification task where I have a 1 or a 0 attached to each firm's 10K filings. I just have this like very abstract problem that I somehow want to take all of this text and back out some representation of a firm's exposure to a macro shock. So you could use an AI model for this. You could use BERT for this. We use a very simple bag of words model that has antecedents in the economics literature, which is basically a very simple bag of words text regression. Okay, so the model is called multinomial inverse regression, which is a bit of a grand term for doing a Poisson regression for every term in the 10K filings. Okay, so very classic bag of words, 14,000 individual terms are in this corpus of 10K filings. every term is going to have a separate association with abnormal returns on the specific jump date that we may be interested in. And from these Poisson regressions, I can form a scalar value that measures a firm's exposure to an aggregate shock by weighting these estimated Poisson regression coefficients on abnormal returns by the frequency with which those terms appear in a firm's 10K file. Okay. So I would call this traditional text analysis. Okay.
Stephen, can I just ask one thing on this?
Yeah.
So, and I know I have seen this before, and actually it links to a question that's just come in about how you build your bag of words, right? You've
Mm-hmm.
limited this to that risk section
Yeah.
of the thing. You know, if I was trying to do this, you might want to also tell it what the firm does, like in its just description of what their job is. You know, ex post, if you asked me to like look at a firm's documents to see whether they're going to react well or badly in COVID, I mean, like just knowing what industry they're in and what they're actually doing, you know, are they selling directly to the public or are they delivering to homes? Like these are the type of things that probably aren't in their risk statement, but they are sort of,
Yeah, so I mean, there's previous work by Hoberg and Phillips that uses the product description section of 10Ks. And in some of the local projection specifications, we include the Hoberg and Phillips sort of text industries. And that doesn't sort of drive out how the content of risk factors drives the growth rates. And I can show you why maybe in one slide. Okay.
and then just sorry, a second one that I wanted to ask. So I guess another advantage of this simple or traditional text approach is you're not that worried about model leakage issues here.
Right.
Whereas if you were to ask an LLM to look at even a document from 2015 and say, "Well, can you predict whether this company will be exposed to a pandemic shock?" There's going to be all sorts of words in there that might be linked with companies who later reported massive
Sure. Yeah,
exposure.
exactly. Exactly. So this is, yeah, exactly. So this is a kind of a pure
Yeah.
separation of the generation of the text from the model that we're fitting onto it. Yeah.
Well, I know I don't want to hold you up much, but I do. I hear very different views on this, right? So one thing you can always do with an LLM is say, don't use any information from beyond 2019. Are you in the that's fine, that's going to condition the LLM's behavior enough? Or are you in the I'm in the sort of more skeptical camp that if the model's been trained on words that appear only because of the pandemic, it's going to know them even if you try to tell it not to use other knowledge, right?
Right.
I'm no
I mean, a
expert.
lot of I don't really work on many empirical problems that I would call pure forecasting. So I don't really think about this too much. But whatever people have established or not established in these exercises, one of the reasons I don't trust them is because I don't know what the AI companies are even doing on any given day. I'm not even sure what model is being served to me when I put, Claude Opus 5 in the API. I'm pretty sure there's different versions of Claude that are being served to me depending on the data center load balance or whatever. So
Okay.
yeah, I guess I remain skeptical. And one of the beautiful things about fine-tuning BERT or using multinomial inverse regression is you just don't have to have that discussion. So I guess that's yet another reason why. I mean, even if it were the case that AI outperformed traditional methods, which I'm about to show you it doesn't, um, these types of arguments, I guess, would work against AI, but we don't even have to have the conversation if it turns out that it's not the right tool for the problem to begin with, even if
Yeah.
it does have some look ahead bias.
Yeah.
So, okay. Ooh, gosh. Yeah, I think I screenshotted this rather than pasted it in. So I'm sorry that the resolution on this is kind of low. But so just because you fit a traditional model doesn't mean that it doesn't provide some interpretable account of heterogeneity, right? So we collect together, we call them air travel terms. Okay, so these are terms that appear in 10Ks and are about airline, travel, airport, whatever, and look at the weighted value of just their coefficients in these Poisson regressions. So I'm super sorry for the low resolution here, but in one NAICS 4 sector, scheduled air transportation, you see that there's a large association between the anticipated negative impact according to the abnormal return measure and the use of these particular terms. So that's been learned, okay? But then there's a bunch of other sectors that are not scheduled air transportation that have a high pandemic exposure via these individual terms, okay? And those include suppliers to the airline industry. They include the people who provide the entertainment on the actual airplanes that you fly and so on, okay? Now, I think the really interesting thing is this. So here I'm returning to my local projection, but separating out the part of the abnormal return that can be explained by these term frequencies in 10Ks and the part of the abnormal return that is uncorrelated with 10K content, okay? So unlike using raw returns, you get much bigger estimated effects on firm level growth from exposure to this macro shock, okay? But if you use the residual, like everything that you cannot explain with text, you get nothing, okay? So if we were to have used a large language model or an AI model to try to fit how much, the return was driven by text, and we achieved a higher R squared in the asset price regression, that would actually be worse because the unexplained variation in asset prices is actually not correlated with what we care about, okay? So in a sense, we have isolated the fundamental part of the asset price change and not used AI models at all. Okay, so I think this is quite a striking example of how a traditional model is able to both give an interpretable account of what drives firm level heterogeneity to macro shocks and solve the statistical problem of denoising asset prices. Okay, so I think there might be nice applications of this in the literature on monetary policy surprises, because you could do the exact same thing, right? Regress these shock measures from bond price changes on, say, current day newspapers or something like that. Okay, so this has been a little bit negative. Yeah, I've given you two problems where AI is not useful. Well, not useful. That's harsh. I don't think traditional text analysis has been replaced in the first two problems that I showed you. In the last application, I think AI really does something useful, which is extract narratives, which are important for measuring economically relevant phenomena that I think it would be difficult to construct an objective validation data set for. Okay. All right, so this problem, and again, this is the joint paper with Michael and Anna and Song, is trying to study how policymakers' risk perceptions influence their policy decisions. Okay. And this is just a motivation slide to say, for many years, monetary policymakers have emphasized that risk and uncertainty are an important input into their policy choices. But even more recently, you see an explicit acknowledgement in large central bank strategy reviews that risk management is being incorporated more and more into the sort of formal structure of how central bank decision making is thought about. Okay, so we want to understand first how you're going to measure perceptions of risk and uncertainty, what are its policy effects, and how you would distinguish the different channels through which risk perceptions might influence policy. And in all these cases, AI is our go-to tool, and Michael may feel differently. It's nice to have two co-authors on the same paper, but I think AI so it didn't start as the go-to tool. Interestingly. So when we first wrote this paper 5 years ago, we were using traditional methods, namely dictionary counts. But as the years have gone on, it turns out that AI models have this surgical quality of being able to extract very precise narratives And in some cases, precise narratives really matter. Okay. So when you think about like firms' 10K filings, maybe like the only important thing is whether you mention air travel or not, right? That's kind of a sufficient statistic for understanding how the demand shock to air travel will impact your returns. But when you think about monetary policy, just mentioning the word risk is not really enough for our purposes because you want to understand the whole narrative context around which somebody uses the word risk, particularly when you want to understand the different channels through which risk perceptions might be driving policy outcomes. And AI, I'm sure, has measurement error in how these narratives are built, but I'm not sure what the alternative would be. So I think bag of words models would have a lot of noise if you tried to place mentions of risk in an appropriate context. So maybe I can be a little bit more specific about the data construction that we do. So we will use FOMC transcripts, and I'm going to assume that most people on this call know what FOMC transcripts are. Okay, so we're going to take a fairly long sample from 1982 to 2019, right? And we're going to exploit the internal structure of FOMC transcripts, which are separated into an economic discussion and a policy discussion, which I will call FOMC 1 and FOMC 2. All right, so the first thing we want to do is measure at the individual level what members' risk preferences are, right? And the way we're going to do that is take each member's FOMC1 text in every meeting and feed it through a large language model. So in this case, Claude Sonnet 4. And we want to map separately for inflation and for growth each member's text into four categories: upside risk, balanced, downside risk, and not discussed at all in that particular, in that particular meeting. So here's some examples. Okay, so I'm not sure how to pronounce this, Bostic or Bostich. The risks to the inflation outlook remain balanced. Okay, so you can imagine that a sufficiently well-crafted dictionary would be able to pick this up, right? You could, at the individual level, just look for a sentence where you saw the co-occurrence of risk and balance. Fine. But then you see this Yellen 1996 statement: we can't dismiss the possibility that compensation growth will drift upward, raising core inflation. I'm not entirely sure how one would design a dictionary to learn this, okay? And unless we did like what the Voice of Monetary Policy paper did and hire RAs to go individually label these, we're not going to be able to fine tune a large language model either. Okay. So when you really have no training data, but you want to measure narratives, AI is really the preferred tool. Okay. Okay. So from these individual level classifications, you can build meeting level objects, right? So at the meeting level, I am going to compute the sort of balance between upside and downside growth categorizations from that LLM query. Okay, so we get a nice time series. So we get separate inflation risk and growth risk series. It turns out that primarily the concern about inflation risk is to the upside, and about growth is to the downside, although there are some deviations around that. And if you are going to use one of these AI models, I think it's important to try to validate it with existing measures. Okay, so I do think that in this particular context, AI is the preferred tool. But I think one role of traditional text methods is to make sure that they're aligned with what you wish to be measuring with the AI tool. So if I were to write down like a statistical model of this, there's a latent variable. Okay, and I'm trying to estimate that latent variable. And in this case, the latent variable is risk perceptions. And I think traditional methods and AI are both measuring the same, hopefully they're measuring the same latent variable. And so hopefully they're aligned, or at least correlated with each other. Okay. So
Stephen, just while you're doing this, because I think it's important given the earlier discussion, but our mutual friend Yuri in Banca d'Italia has asked just to say a little bit more about the FOMC prompt essentially that you gave. Like,
Oh
did
yeah,
we
thank you.
zero shot or did we give it examples? And I don't know which number is the number of shots, but we definitely gave them examples.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, whenever I've used an AI model, I guess I do implicit few shot learning in the sense that, I start with a prompt, look at the output, and then correct the prompt based on errors that I found in the initial output. And one of the errors that arose from a naive prompt, which was just, categorize people into these four categories using their FOMC1 language, is that sometimes individuals would disagree with the staff forecast. So the staff had a particular inflation forecast, and a particular member had a higher inflation forecast. So in the naive query, that was called upside inflation risk. Okay. But that's not what we want to measure. Okay. We want to measure disagreement about higher moments. Okay. So one of the modifications to the prompt was to include a line or two saying, if somebody disagrees with the staff forecast, that is not balance of risks. You need a kind of explicit, some explicit evidence that the disagreement is about higher moments, not just forecast disagreement. So when you look at this Yellen quotation, for example, we can't dismiss the possibility that compensation growth will drift upward. I guess there's been, I mean, she doesn't say risk, but I guess the LLM has honed in on this sort of probability language to indicate that what's really being expressed is there's some probability of a tail risk. So that's not just forecast disagreement. That's that, we disagree about the probability of a tail, which is a kind of a variance skew phenomenon. Okay, so Michael and Anna and Song and I spent at least 2 years constructing dictionaries. Okay, and we constructed one dictionary that we thought would capture uncertainty. So we measured inflation uncertainty, deflation uncertainty, growth uncertainty, and called them policymakers uncertainty indices, PMU indices. Okay. And then we thought, well, separately, there may be sort of directional effects on the FOMC. So we built these sentiment measures, okay, which are basically measuring whether FOMC members' language talk about inflation going up and growth going up. Well, it turns out that these balance of risk measures sort of combine both things, right? Because there's both uncertainty, say you're uncertain about whether inflation will overshoot target, but then there's also a kind of directionality to that because it's really about the skew of the distribution, not just the mean preserving spread. So something kind of very nice is that these LLM-based balance of risk measures correlate in the expected ways with both the uncertainty the uncertainty dictionary and the sentiment dictionary. So we're really picking up like both uncertainty and the direction that that uncertainty might go with this balance of risk measure. Okay.
Stephen, I'm just going to interrupt you one more time because Ella has asked a question and has been very patient. The question is actually a bit more broad. It's about how you build your bag of words or how you would think about creating a dictionary, whether you use other methods like topic modeling to create a dictionary. And again, I don't want to make it the answer just about this. We can come back to it at the end. But I think one thing I always liked about some of our measures here is that when we created them, we actually used the word embeddings approach on the actual domain we were looking at, so the FOMC transcripts, and we basically said we want words related to risk and words related to uncertainty, and we largely just took the top, I don't know, about 40 or 50 of these words. So to answer Ella's question, like you can do that, but as I sort of and I think I'm yeah, I'm going to just say I know for sure, but I'm 99% certain that the word possibility was in that set. But whether or not it would pick it up together with the compensation drift,
Hmm.
in the same way, that I can't be certain of. But one of the dangers of the dictionary approach is, of course, no matter how you construct it, it has this kind of 0-1 effect. If the word is in the dictionary, it will count. And if it's just outside and you've chosen to draw your line somewhere, it doesn't. Whereas the LLM, at least my reading of it is, it takes a slightly more context specific interpretation of each word and picks up things that I guess we would want included.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's the answer to
Yeah.
the question. Okay, so I know I'm running a little bit out of time, so let me just maybe establish two more kind of results, let's say. So for those of you who follow the monetary policy shock literature, there are these kind of Romer and Romer shocks, which orthogonalize the Fed funds rate with respect to Green Book controls. Now, more recently, there are these Aroba and Dreschel shocks, which explicitly correct for the fact that in some cases, the mean forecast might diverge from the modal forecast. Okay, so the Green Book controls are modal forecasts produced by the staff. And if you think that the inflation or growth distributions have a skew, then the means of those distributions might diverge from the modes. Okay, and so what you're calling a monetary policy shock might just be FOMC members reacting to the fact that balance of risks induce expected economic outcomes that the Green Book controls are not capturing. Okay, so I'll call them AD from now on. These AD shocks are meant to strip out this sort of certainty equivalence view of why balance of risk measures would influence policy outcomes. Now, when you introduce our balance of risks, inflation, and growth variables into a regression, which just try, these are simple univariate regressions, we can explain variation in this AD shock from balance of growth. Okay, so you'll see that the coefficient on the balance of risk measure drops when you go from the Romer and Romer shock to the AD shock, which is consistent with the idea that maybe part of the balance of risk effect on policy is coming from a divergence between the mean and the mode, but it's not everything because we keep being able to explain the shock measure, which was meant to control for that. So why? Like, why would it be that policymakers' risk perceptions drove policy choices above and beyond expected economic conditions? So we have a particular view on this, which has been discussed quite a bit in the history of the FOMC, even though it hasn't been part of the academic literature for at least not in a big way that we're aware of. And this is the idea of insurance, okay? That there are adverse outcomes that might arise in the future, but that if we take a sufficiently aggressive policy action today, we can reduce the probability of those. So unlike the certainty equivalence view, which is that balance of risk just measures a sort of fixed expectation of economic conditions, the insurance view is that our action today can endogenously change the probability of this future outcome. Okay. And so how are we going to measure that? Sorry, I'm getting a, here we go. Am I, sorry, I got a WhatsApp call I had to kill. This is even, all right, let me just turn this off, sorry. So this is an even more subtle narrative concept. So how are we going to measure whether FOMC members explicitly mention insurance in their policy reasoning? So we're going to again use an AI model, now apply to FOMC2 statements, which remember are when FOMC members are discussing policy actions, to ask for two different kinds of narrative reasoning. Okay, the first is that insurance has been invoked in the policy discussion. Okay, and we view insurance as explicitly arguing for taking an action to hedge against uncertain future risks. Second, we want to see some causal link in language that because of this insurance motive that a member has expressed, that is directly linked to the policy action that they advocate. Okay. And it turns out that a little bit less than half of meetings have insurance reasoning. And if insurance reasoning is the reason why people are reacting to balance of risks perceptions, then it should be the case that these AD shocks are large when people are talking about insurance. Okay. So I present to you what I consider a very nice figure where the AD shock distribution is in gray in the background. And then I'm just binning different parts of that distribution and giving you the percentage of FOMC meetings in that part of the distribution where insurance was explicitly invoked as the reason for the policy action. So we get this super nice U shape, right? Where when the FOMC is not taking surprising decisions and you're in the, you're in the middle of the shock distribution, insurance is not mentioned very often as a motivator for a policy action. But then you go out in the tails of the distribution, and the vast majority of meetings that are surprising mention insurance. Okay. So one more thing we can establish then is if balance of risks measures are driving AD shock variation because of insurance, you should see that the correlation between balance of risk measures and AD shocks arises primarily in insurance meetings. So this is the last regression that I will show you, where I'm again regressing the AD shock on our balance of risks measures, but now I'm interacting it with insurance. Okay. And what you see is that in these insurance meetings, that is when variation in inflation and growth risk perceptions are driving variation in this shock. All right. So I know it's been a bit fast, but I think the nice thing about this is we start with an economic model in mind. I haven't given you the equations in the presentation for time reasons, but you can write down a policy rule in which insurance shows up. But then if you want to test that theory, you really need a measure of insurance. And I don't know how one would obtain one. Even if I hired PhD macro students here and sat them down to read FOMC2, I don't know that they could identify insurance any better than this AI model, right? So I'm not sure that kind of gold standard human labels even exist for these subtle narrative concepts. But we're able to, extract these narratives, validate what was extracted. So Michael has done some reading of the extracted text that justifies the LLM's attribution of insurance to meetings, and come up with this kind of very nice coherent story about why balance of risks feed through into policy. So in conclusion, just because AI models exist and are easy to use via APIs does not make them the optimal solution to all economic measurement problems. So I would say if you have a quote unquote traditional measurement problem where there is an objective, human labeled data set, I would fine tune a small large language model and maybe not even do that. It could be that in some cases, logistic regression, a bag of words works. Okay. But I really think that AI models open new avenues for narrative analysis for these subjective, hard to measure concepts. Okay. So depending on the style of research you're doing and the question you're answering, I think AI is better than traditional methods. Or not. Okay. In any case, let me emphasize there's always an econometric problem in the background that there will be measurement error in these AI extracted variables. And so it's important to kind of think in parallel about the econometric issues that might introduce. But I might leave it at that, Michael, and happy to take any more questions.
Yeah, okay. I've got a couple that have come in. But I may need you to go back to your slides at some point. I don't know if you have them in these slides or the other slides that I know you have. This is one of the downsides of having a webinar that you're giving a webinar that's hosted by someone who knows other slides that you have, because I can start calling on them. But I gotta go in reverse order now. So Michael Kiley mentions that there is this literature on risk management, and he mentions the Greenspan AER paper. Michael, we love that paper. In fact, that's one of the kind of striking things that this we show in the paper. You really see this risk management logic taking hold under Greenspan, but continuing after Greenspan. But even still, it's that paper is now scarily 22 years old, and yet it hasn't necessarily sort of permeated how we think about writing down models of optimal policy, and therefore how we'd estimate things like a monetary reaction function. So it's a super important paper, but I think we're trying to bring some real empirical evidence to match Greenspan telling us what he said he did. But Julian Pinter then asks, and it's a great question, and this is why I know you have the slides to answer it. You said that the issue in evaluating the AI tool's performance is that we do not have an objective validation data set. Okay. Should we instead somehow evaluate against subjective validation data set? You mentioned that, at times I have done audits of transcripts, made my own separate data set, and we compare them. But what are the other ways that we can do this? And I wanted you to show the SEP regressions.
Yeah, so one thing that I was a little bit surprised by is the following. So I thought that there was a gold standard data set available in this environment called the Summary of Economic Projections. So for those of you who don't know, starting from 2008, I think 4 times a year, coinciding with FOMC meetings, members fill out a survey, and the survey responses are collated to something called the Summary of Economic Projections. And a survey question is the following: please indicate your judgment of the risk weighting around your projections with 3 responses: weighted to downside, broadly balanced, weighted to upside. Well, this looks extremely similar to what the LLM was trying to produce, right? So you might think, well, perfect. I can use the SEP response as ground truth data. And if there's a deviation from this ground truth in the LLM responses, that gives me some notion of accuracy. So here are the confusion matrices. Okay. And again, apologies for the poor resolution, but hopefully you can see these dark blue cells. Okay. So the SEP upside, balanced, and downside is being tabulated on the rows, and the LLM upside, balanced, downside is being tabulated on the columns. And you can see that when the SEP says upside, the vast majority of LLM responses are also upside. Likewise for downside inflation and downside growth. There are some mismatches. In particular, there are many mismatches on this balanced dimension. Okay, so I thought, fine, the error rate of the LLM is something, and in fact, you could start fine tuning then, right? If you were to take the SEP responses as gold standard, I could actually fine tune BERT, okay, in order to align with the SEP. Well, then I started to read some of these mismatches, and it's not at all clear to me that the SEP is gold standard. Okay, so here's some examples of mismatches. Maybe this Bullard one in September 2016 is the most dramatic. So the large language model said that Bullard expressed downside inflation risks. Bullard's SEP submission was upside inflation risks. This is verbatim from FOMC1. I do remain concerned that market-based measures of inflation expectations remain too low to be consistent with the 2% inflation forecast. This is a risk to the outlook that I have described. So it could be that when this individual went to fill out the SEP, at that moment in time, they thought they were upside inflation risks. And then when they sat down in the FOMC meeting, they had changed their minds. But even in that situation, the relevant object is what they say in the meeting, right? Because I want to understand how risk perceptions feed through into policy. I would argue that the relevant object is what they say in deliberation, not what they say in these SEP surveys. So this was a surprise to me. So I would not fine tune BERT against the SEP because I think the SEP has noise too. So I'm not sure whether that was Julian's question, but this was kind of interesting to me. The other big issue, of course, is that these confusion matrices condition on the LLM um, classifying risk mentions at all. In at least half of speaker meeting pairs, the LLM classification is not discussed. So whereas the SEP would kind of force you to write down some, risk view, the another advantage of the LLM is that it only picks up a risk view if it's relevant for policy deliberation. Okay, so if you wrote it down in the SEP but didn't mention it in FOMC1, it's not going to be captured. And again, I would argue that that's the right classification.
Yeah, so I'll just add one other thing that so I think Julian's question is the right one. You must question what you're measuring and check. But we also you showed that for some of the measures we also used some of the traditional dictionary approaches to sort of validate that these things are at least going in the right direction. And then there's another exercise that we do, which I would call, I guess, external validity in a sense, where we take the balance of risk measures and look at them as sort of deviants from other people at the same time and show that those with those views are more likely to dissent in the direction that the balance of risks would take you. So
Yeah.
again, there's no way of perfectly pinning it, but it does. There are a number of ways you can sort of reassure yourself and hopefully can reassure your audience and your readership that you've got the right measure. Um, I had uh, I had one other question that I thought you might have a view on, and it's the measurement error one. And you've mentioned it a few times, and I don't want in the last few minutes of this for you to get into the pure technicalities of it. But are we sometimes a bit harsh on text and LLM or other sort of what we would call generated regressors, in the sense that, of course, they have measurement error, but so does the national accounts, which we happily use as, manna from the economic gods and perfectly measured. Like we know that in most countries there are structural revisions to GDP data as new information comes out, and then after 5 years you can get these sort of big benchmark revisions. We don't we don't usually give macroeconomists a hard time for not taking that into account in their work. Is that equivalent, or is there a reason I should worry more about this LLM or dictionary based stuff?
I mean, at least the approach we've taken is that if you're the one who builds the sausage machine, then you can use that information to build a bias correction, right?
Yeah.
So if we knew a little bit more about how national accounts are built, there would be ways of building bias corrections for standard macroeconometric models. But I don't think anyone has, entered the production of national statistics in sufficient detail to understand that. I mean, I think there's a literature on measurement error correction and nightlight detection, right? There's this big thing in
Yeah.
development economics that uses nightlight intensity as a regressor for measuring development. I think there have been some econometric models getting into the measurement error issues there, which use the precise details of satellite photo, technology and stuff like that. So I don't think that this discussion is kind of without precedence in the literature, and I think as a variable gets more and more important in the empirical literature, um, doing what you can to address bias in estimation is an important project. I should also say that the measurement error in these text-generated regressors is not classical. It's not like you can pick up an econometrics textbook and implement a known formula. So there's sort of misclassification error interacting with sampling error, and how that plays out in inference is not straightforward.
Good. Okay. Maybe one last request of you then, and sorry to put you on the spot for this, But if somebody listening on this call was thinking, right, I'm now going to, I haven't done text or LLMs, and I'm sort of thinking I'm going to get into it. What would you say are the key things that they should have in mind for their methodology for their research? Like, benchmarking, testing. What do you think are the screaming things that you sometimes see papers written and you go, gosh, they missed this very obvious basic.
Yeah, so I don't think there's enough benchmarking exercises done. I mean, that's just so um, the kinds of exercises. I mean, I like this Voice of Monetary Policy paper. It's great. But it's very low hanging fruit to just report how your methodology on a given performance metric of interest to you compares to others. I mean, it turns out that fine-tuning BERT looks like the right tool in that problem, but you could easily compare it to other methods like logistic regression or whatever. And I think if one were to do that, at least you've made clear what the trade-offs are in choosing different methods. I'm not sure what, I mean, I know you've worked in different fields and published, not just in economics, but in computational linguistics, maybe some engineering. I think this is standard outside economics, right? That there's a variety of methods that one could choose. So let's just use them all and try to understand which one is best after a benchmarking exercise. Where for some reason in economics, people just like pick a method and implement it. And like, why? I'm not entirely sure sometimes.
No, that's right. And in fact, I sometimes felt that the other literatures, that was all they were doing, right? Like the whole paper, and I have published in this, so mea culpa or whatever. But, the whole paper is here's an idea of a better algorithm, faster or whatever. Now I'm going to do it on a data set where we know what the outcomes are, and we're going to do the test and we're going to do the evaluation. And when we do that, I'm going to show you my, I don't know, macro F1 score is higher and consistently better model, and that's it. And then, yeah, like you say, in economics we sort of have lots of papers, including our own ones in the past even, so we're also guilty in the past of not benchmarking maybe enough, where we've looked at things and gone, yeah, well, this has some external validity, and just one thing and we're sort of done. But I do agree that benchmarking is a
I mean,
good
I
way to
don't
go.
I don't know if this is too maybe controversial or sociological, but sometimes I get the feeling in economics, maybe there's less interest or emphasis on like data per se. So it's more about just kind of getting something that looks mildly plausible and works so that we can talk about the interesting thing, which is fitting the model and teasing out the policy implications of it. Whereas like getting into the guts of how, the particular parsing rule for a classifier affects performance is like that's Appendix F, right? And sometimes I wish the profession would engage a little bit more in just like data issues rather than view them as the plumbing to be shoved aside while we talk about the more like interesting things.
I'm laughing because often when I speak to like PhD students or anyone who asks me, maybe there's a sort of positive versus normative view going on here, but I always tell them that if you want to get published, you've got to focus on the economics. Because I think that is actually true. I think in most submissions to journals, if you have deep measurement things, they're going to be difficult to publish, and certainly in top journals. But maybe you're right. Maybe that's because our preferences are not quite where they should be. But maybe on that philosophical note, we should end it.
Yeah, I mean, when you leave academia and you work in central banks or private banks, they care a lot about data, right? So I think it has real value in the world. It's just in academia, it's a bit downplayed.
Yeah. Okay, well, Stephen, thank you so much. I think you answered perfectly well the question that no, what we would call traditional text analysis still has an important role to play, and probably can be deployed much more easily in a world where we now have Claude, not the LLM, but Claude, the friendly agent helping us to write our code for Python, etc. So those lower costs, hopefully level the playing field a bit in terms of ability to do this. But yeah, thank you so much. It's been incredibly valuable. Thank you to everybody else who joined. I'm going to mention one particular person. I get to see everyone who joins and others don't. But one person who joined, who I do want to give a shout out to, because I hope it's the right person, is our former colleague at LSE, Carlo Rosa, who I consider to be like one of the OG text analysis people in economics. He did it way before certainly you or I were thinking about it, and probably was too far ahead of his time to get all the credit for it. So since he joined, I thought it would be worth calling him out, as he was our well, a couple of years ahead of us classmate. But yeah, no, thank you
Oh.
everyone for joining. Come back to the next one, which is in May. You'll get the detail, 21st of May, and it's Michael Ehrman, long-term friend of the show, if you will. But otherwise, enjoy the better weather and see you soon.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everybody. Bye bye.